Okay, hey, good morning, everybody. We are here in a coastal town in Turkey. It's a nice day. This is what you see behind me, some ancient wharves, very similar to the ones in Tyre. However, in Tyre, there are no cliffs on the ocean. It's just kind of flatter, and it goes out into the ocean. So similar, but not exactly the same. This chapter is called The Blue-Eyed Man. And you'll probably remember from the first chapter, he talked about the sea people having blue eyes, or at least some of them. Okay, so let's get going with this one and see. I don't know if it'll be the same blue-eyed man or maybe someone different, but anyway, let's see what's going on. Uriah is now in Tyre, in Canaan, in the land of Canaan, which is today modern day Turkey. The Blue-Eyed Man, chapter 4. Who is Jotham? I said to Hannibal. He was showing me about the city that morning so that I could see the extent of his father's possessions and how he managed his affairs. We walked, we walked, for Hannibal said that he could move faster than his chair carriers who were very lazy. Jotham is our kinsman, said Hannibal. My father loves him because his mother was his favorite niece and was lost to our family many years ago. Okay, here comes one of those side stories that I told you you need to pay attention to. Jotham's mother was a niece to Ethbal. Okay, we're going to kind of put all these things together. Okay, and it says it was his favorite niece that was lost to our family many years ago. But he says that he is not one of you. He is not, replied Hannibal. He comes from an evil and blasphemous people. He is a Hebrew. So the Canaanites feel that the Hebrews are blasphemous and evil. And remember, the Hittites felt that the Egyptians were accursed. So you're seeing these prejudice and biases even way back in the ancient world that unfortunately we still have around today, but they didn't just crop up. They've been around forever, almost. All right. What is a Hebrew? They were men of Canaan long ago. Then when the desert tribes and shepherd chiefs moved down into Egypt in a time of trouble, they were among them. They became conquerors and rulers there. The great dynasty of Egypt rose up against them and enslaved all those who were not driven out. Years later, some of their tribes escaped into the desert, returned to Canaan, and took over many of the towns to the south from the Egyptian governors. They have been driven out of most of them, and with the help of Egypt, we keep them down as best we can. But they still make trouble for us. So the Hebrews were in Egypt at one time and then were driven out. Do you know any story about that? Have you ever heard of the Exodus? Have you ever heard of Moses? And he led his people from Egypt and parted the Red Sea. Have you ever heard those stories? Okay, well, that's what they're talking about here. Then how is Jotham your kinsman? His mother was my cousin, but she turned her back on her family to marry Jotham's father. Now, in the eye of these Hebrew tribes, Jotham's father did wrong in taking a wife from the Canaanites, a strange woman, as they would call her. Why is that? Because they worship the desert god, Java, different pronunciations, who they now say is the same as El, the Almighty, and Adoni, the Lord. They may worship no other but him, for they say that he is jealous of the others. They call him Israel, the fighters of God. And Our Lady, the Holy Astarte, they say is an abomination. So they are Baals or Baals, they say both ways, of our city, and so are the beautiful images of our holy ones. He was beginning to get angry, and I reminded him that he had been telling me about Jotham. So you're seeing that the Hebrews had the concept of a monotheistic religion with one true God. But the other people, the Canaanites and the ancient people in the area, the Egyptians, the Hittites, and everybody else, had multiple gods. And then, if you know anything about kind of Old Testament stories, and maybe even the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not have any other god before me, is what he wrote, what God was said to have written on the tablets he gave to Moses. So you're seeing kind of the history here unfold between the people and the different religions, and kind of the feelings that they had towards each other based on their religious beliefs. All right. So in this case, the Canaanites aren't liking the Hebrews because the Hebrews kind of badmouth their gods and say their gods are no good. Only ours is the good God. Jotham's mother, our kinswoman, died when he was a child. His father, Amram, died a few years later. Amram was a prosperous man, as these hill tribes counted. Jotham inherited flocks and herds, and all would have gone well with him if he had not had an uncle in the south, in a town of Gaza, who was a real scoundrel. So it sounds like Jotham's uncle was a bad guy. His dad had property. His dad had owned land and was fairly wealthy, considering he was a hill tribe person. But nobody looked good, especially the Hebrews did not look kindly on Jotham's father taking a wife that was Canaanite. I waited patiently while he stopped to buy 2 cakes from a street vendor. Is this uncle a Hebrew? I asked him, for I had assumed that they were all country tribesmen living in the hills. Of course, said Hannibal, but he is a man of wealth and position in Gaza. And I have heard that he honors Astarte and the Baals like everyone else. He is a real scoundrel, though, and he wanted his brother's property too. So he went to Jotham's tribe and stirred them against him. He said that Jotham had no right to his father's possessions, in that his mother was a strange woman, someone who was not Hebrew, who had kept an image of Astarte in her tent. So they drove Jotham out, and the uncle got the flocks and the herds. So he was, all his birthright was taken from him. I felt a new sympathy for Jotham, but I wondered, since it was Tyre that had sheltered him when his own people had driven him out, and why he had called Tyre a den of evil. Here is the street of the weavers, said Hannibal, and I saw that he had come to one of his father's enterprises. Hannibal took me into one of his father's work sheds, a dark place, noisy with the rattle of shuttles. A man with a whip walked among the weavers, supervising their work. No voices were heard. The looms were worked by women and children. This surprised me, for at home slaves were seldom given regular work until they were grown. I said so, and Hannibal was shocked. We cannot afford such waste, he said. Should we squander our longshoremen and our stronger women on light work such as this? Labor is expensive, and my father's workers are always well fed to keep up their strength. Where would my family be if we spent our money for no return? So he's saying it's okay to have slaves that are women and children, that children can work this hard. And even though they had slaves in Great Hatti, Uriah's like, what? How can you guys treat people like this? They don't talk much, I observed. They're not allowed to talk. How much work would be done if the workers were allowed to gossip? Besides, we want no trouble among them. All the goods you make here in Tyre, I said. It must take many slaves. How do you get them? Very important question. How do you get these slaves? We trade for them among the foreigners, said Hannibal. And sometimes our merchants go to warring tribes or nations and buy up the prisoners of war at a low price. We can get them cheaply, too, from the slave traders of the desert. But it is cheapest of all to take them from among the Hebrews in the hills. They just go out to the Hebrew tribes and round up as many slaves as they can get and bring them back here and make them work. Hannibal also showed me his father's coppersmithy. It was a small shop, smaller shop than the weaving rooms, and was hotter than I could bear because of the furnaces in which the metal was melted. The slave labor stayed by the furnaces, heating and pouring the metal. They seemed very pale. I suppose it was because they worked long hours, stopping only for a few minutes to eat and for a few hours at night. "Some day," said Hannibal, "I will take you to the dye houses on the shore, where we send our cloth for coloring. Not till you become used to things, though, or the smell will sicken you. The purple dye, remember the purple dye? Purple dye is made by grinding snails that have the coloring inside them. It is a costly process, for it takes so many of the sea creatures. Then, too, the men who pull the grindstones must be the strongest slaves. That is why they are blinded." Okay, what did I just, okay, pay attention to this. That is why they are blinded, so there is no chance of their escaping. They are very expensive, and as the work is hard, they don't live long. That is why only great men can afford purple. So now we know what purple is all about. It's made by the strongest slaves who were blinded so that they will not run away. And these slaves don't last long because the work is so hard. And that's why purple, only the richest and the greatest people wear purple. If I had the money I lived back then, I would not wear purple, especially if I knew how it was made. It's pretty gross. That's pretty messed up. All right, let's keep going. "I found that my morning meal was not resting so easily in my stomach. Just hearing this is making Uriah sick." Jotham was in Ethbal's big warehouse on the waterfront when we reached it. He was counting bolts of cloth, which are just big bundles that are folded up, and making marks on a soft clay tablet with a reed pen. Hannibal gave him a pleasant greeting and asked if there was any work I could do to show me how things were done. "One who cannot read and write?" said Jotham sourly. "What work could he do?" But he told me to climb the ladder and call off to him the articles that were stacked on the shelves so that he might list them. "At least," he said, "you speak the language." Before it came, I was longing for the midday meal. For if the slaves of Canaan labored unceasingly, so did their masters. I was high on the ladder, shouting down to Jotham of 3 bolts of the thinnest wool, stained with the purple dye, when I heard a jingle as of little bells and looked down to see Mehitabel smiling up at me. She herself had brought the food, bread, cheese, wine, and figs, and Jotham was angry. "It is not right," he said, "for a woman of good family to walk in the streets alone." "I did not walk," said Mehitabel. "I came in the chair and I covered my face. Come and walk on the waterfront while you finish your meal." It was the hottest time of the day, but did not seem unpleasant, with that strange salt air blowing gently in from the sea. The waterfront and the wharves were made of stone, whose heat burned pleasantly through my sandals. The wharves swarmed with longshoremen loading cargoes onto black tub-like ships, urged on by foremen armed with bronze-tipped spears who shouted commands in hoarse voices. Down by a dock at the bend of the waterfront, cargo was being unloaded from a galley that had cast anchor. Mehitabel waved toward it proudly, saying that it was her father's, just back from a trip to the islands in the Western Sea. "The shipmaster," she said, looking at Jotham, "will have presents for me." "You do wrong to take his presents," said Jotham. "He is a treacherous man, and your father is a fool to trust him." Mehitabel laughed. These are all clues into what's going on in this story, so pay attention. This is the really kind of the weirdest and the most important clue right now, this small boy. A small boy was walking along the docks accompanied by a manservant. He was dressed in a rich tunic of many colors and had sandals of the softest leather on his feet. The servant rebuked him for kicking pebbles with them. The people who saw him stopped and stared, and many kissed the sacred amulet that hung about their necks and made references. Mehetabel and Jotham stopped too. And when the child saw them, he ran to them. Mehetabel dropped to her knees beside him, kissing his hands and stroking his curly hair. He was a pretty child, but pale and cross-looking, spoiled by all the homage he was receiving. "Who is he?" I said when he had gone by, thinking him perhaps the son of the ruler of the city. "He is a cousin of mine," said Mehetabel. "Jabin is his name. Some people say Jabin. I typically say Jabin. He is the firstborn child of a kinsman of my father." To my surprise, I saw that she had turned pale. Jotham had not bowed or spoken, but had stared at the child with eyes that seemed to burn with some strange feeling. "Look away from him," he said. "He is already dead." What? So all these people are kissing him and treating him with such kindness and respect, and then Jotham says, "Don't look away from him. He's already dead." He's also the firstborn child of a kinsman to Mehetabel's father. Really weird. It's very strange. I want to find out what's going on. I turned to him curiously. A firstborn child, Mehetabel had said. Ethbal too had spoken of his firstborn son, and that he had died. But he had not said how. I opened my mouth to ask, but before I could speak, a man nearby, carrying timber for a ship's hull, stumbled and fell, damaging the material he had carried. A spear-carrying foreman, who's like a boss, hurried over to him, struck him with the butt end of the spear, and raised it for another blow. Suddenly something happened in my mind, and I was no longer on the waterfront at Tyre. This is all in his mind. I was back in Arzawa, and the captain of the sea people was beating my father to death. Without a sound, I sprang upon the foreman, wrenched the spear away from him, and struck him with it across the side of the head. I heard the people around me cry out. I felt a bleak joy and struck the foreman again across the jaw, knocking him down on the stones. I might have killed him if another man had not come upon the scene at that moment, seized me and swung me aside in one powerful motion. And when I saw him, I nearly did go mad. For he had blue eyes and curling bronze hair, so that when I looked into his face, I thought I was looking at that same blue-eyed man who had killed my father. I sprang at him too, but this time I was driven off in earnest. A big, powerful dog leaped upon my shoulders, snarling fiercely and bearing me down upon the pavement. "Back, Pelops!" shouted the man, and the dog did let go, still growling softly. The foreman, in the meantime, had recovered himself and was hurrying off, shouting that his master would bring charges against the family of Ethbal. I gathered myself together and got to my feet, staring at the stranger. He was, of course, not the man who had killed my father. He did not even look like him, for though tall and strong, he was slender and graceful and elegant of manner. It was only his eyes and hair and height that had reminded me of the Achaeans at home. He spoke to Jotham as if he knew him. "Have you all gone mad?" he asked. "Why did you stop him?" asked Jotham bitterly. I stared at him in amazement and realized that his joy in the beating of the foreman had been the same as my own. So Jotham liked that Uriah was beating up that foreman. The foreman was beating up the slave, and so then Uriah beat up the foreman. The stranger laughed suddenly and gave Jotham a scornful salaam. "My apologies, young master," he said. "I forgot that the punishment of a servant might offend you. It is hard to remember that a lord of Tyre is a kinsman of slaves." A lord of Tyre is a kinsman of slaves. Jotham is a lord of Tyre, yet a kinsman of slaves. Jotham turned pale, but Mehetabel spoke hastily. "Jotham is right," she said, surprisingly. These men who wear out their labor in that way deserve to be beaten. Some of them even put children to work in the furnaces and mines and lose them before they are grown. Is it any wonder that they ruin themselves buying new workers? I have heard stories of you too, Akil. So the guy who's the Greek or the sea people, the sea guy, Akil, the Greek or Akil, and how you drive your oarsmen. Akil, it seemed, was the master of her father's ship. I guessed from his looks and his manner of speech that he was some kind of foreigner. He was looking at me now, and it was with the look of the sea people in Arzawa. Who is this one? He said. Fair-skinned for a Canaanite, isn't he? And such a fine nose. I can guess where he's from. There are many young ruffians of his kind nowadays hiding out in safe corners of the world. He laughed and turned away. I started toward him, forgetting the dog Pelops, but I felt a restraining hand on my shoulder and saw that it was Jotham's. We looked at each other curiously, and I knew that from now on we would probably be friends. He and Jotham would probably be friends because they both agree that you should not, they don't like the way you treat a slave like that by punishing them and beating them. And Jotham probably respects the way Uriah came to the slave's rescue and beat up the foreman. All right, and this they call in biblical terms and in those times they would call the sea people or the Greeks the Philistines. So there's a lot of different names that they go by, but in our book we're going to refer to them as the Achaeans. It's all the same. It's all the Greek people, the Greeks. In this case, they call them the sea people. All right, and the sea people aren't made up just of Greeks. They're kind of a big collection of people from all over. All right. Anyway, so I'm going to go down and have me some fish and chips. They have good fish and chips here. And you guys have a great day yourself. Okay? Till tomorrow, take care.